Okay, a horrible thing has just happened. I saw a light come on the dash, and it's a brake indicator light on this F-150. If the brake indicator light comes on, it means the system has detected a loss of pressure in the system, or one of the major brake components has failed. And here, you guys observe. See if you see anything. There's definitely a leak. I have pinpointed the location of that leak, and the location of that leak is right here, kind of in front of the wheel, up above and on the other side of the frame. So if you look up in here, you can see where the frame is running along there, and it's on the other side, kind of up in between. It's where it is mounted in a little bracket where it just kind of rusted through. So for now, in order to get it up and running, I'm just going to run a new brake line from the connection points that are available and accessible. The first connection point is right above the left side of the pumpkin right there, and I was able to thread that apart. And then sliding underneath the truck here, our second spot is right above this frame member coming across the bottom right at the back of the transmission. You can see right up in here I've already disconnected the line, so here's the brake line. So I disconnected that little portion right there, and we're gonna replace this section going all the way back to the pumpkin. All the way up to right there where we will reconnect our new brake line. So the tools that we're going to be needing to do this is a double flaring tool, which I have right here. I'll link to this one in the description below. And then we're going to be using some 3/16 copper nickel brake line, which is a lot nicer product than working with steel. It's a little bit more pliable, and obviously it's corrosion resistant. So I'll link to that. And then you'll have to get whatever end pieces that you need. Now if you pick up some double flaring union pieces, basically is what I have here, then you can actually get by with less fittings. So on the far end, this is the side of that brake line that is up near the front of the truck. This particular connection right here is the original flare, and it's a little bit different style fitting. So I'm going to leave this, and I'm actually going to reuse this. So this little chunk of line right here in between is a piece of steel brake line that I'm going to reuse. I'll probably paint it a little bit so that hopefully it resists corrosion a little bit longer. But then I'm just going to use one of my union fittings here to connect onto my new copper nickel brake line going all the way back to the pumpkin. I'll just show you what this looks like when I take this union apart. You can see that I've already completed my double flare. So there's my double flare connection. It's not the most beautiful thing in the world, but we'll make sure that we check it for leaks. And then you can see inside of this union that there's kind of a tapered part that is poking out towards us, and that will meet up with this connection point that we made here on our double flare. And then our flare nut just tightens in. As long as we get this good and tight, we should be good to go. This is an allowable flare for brake lines. This is not compression, this is a double flare. So with that, then we will obviously be taking a second one of these on our copper nickel line and then connecting that to there. So by having this union here, I'm not having to redo this flare. I think it's called like a bubble flare, and I think it's different than a double flaring tool, and I don't have that. This is the side of the brake line that attaches near the rear axle of the truck, and this actually uses a standard double flare. You can still see the original double flare is still in there, and so we are able to just abandon this this fitting here, and I'll probably just use one of my new ones. Just going to make sure that the threads match up fine, and I believe that they do. So I'll be able to just do a standard double flare on the opposite end of my brake line. So now I'm actually going to try to pull the brake line out, the old brake line. I'm going to try to pull it out of where it is at right now, and remember the way it was routed as much as possible. This is a fairly straightforward one. I think it shouldn't be too bad. But either way, let's take a quick look. I'll try to run the camera down the length of the line that we're going to be replacing so you guys have a clear picture of what we're working on. So there's the front of the truck. And right up here inside of the frame, you can see there's that spot where we already disconnected the line. And then the line goes back this direction, just kind of following the top edge of the frame. And they're mounted in these little plastic clips, kind of looks like. So it should be fairly easy to snap out of there. And then going up in between here next to the gas tank, it's a little bit tighter. Might be kind of hard to see up in there. Right there is another one of those brackets, so I'll have to pop it loose from there. It makes its way down, and actually up in here is where the actual leak was happening. So right inside of that bracket right there on the top, you can see how rusty that is. That is the spot where it actually started to leak brake fluid. So then running down, it just keeps running up inside of that frame until it gets right back to here. And then I'll show you, I'll roll around the other side. All right, so we are at the behind the rear differential and axle now. So if we look straight up above this, you can see that we have our brake line tees off right here on the axle. And if you follow this rubber hose up, that rubber hose then connects onto our steel brake line. And you can see that that's where I disconnected that last fitting. So it just comes out of the frame right there next to the gas tank, and then attaches onto this rubber hose down to the rear axle, where it then tees off and goes to each caliper on each side of the axle here. This is the spot where I had to thread that connector out, and in order to disconnect that steel brake line. So I actually just used a crescent wrench and held this whole bracket in place. So that bracket right there I just held in place with a crescent wrench, and then I was able to turn it out surprisingly easily given how much rust there is underneath this thing. Okay, that didn't take but a couple minutes. I was able to just snap it out of its brackets just by grabbing a hold of it and wiggling it and pushing it out or prying it out. And then was able to slide it back. I took the brake line and slid it back a little bit in order to get it around a piece of the wiring harness. And then I pulled the whole thing out going forward underneath the truck. So hopefully that helps you a little bit, but it's pretty self-explanatory. So you can see we have some pre-bent portions of this line. Nothing too crazy. It's pretty straight for the most part. But what I'm going to do is I'm going to take my copper nickel brake line and I'm going to lay that out right next to it and kind of pre-bend it in the same shape as much as I can. And then we'll know our exact length that we need for our copper nickel line. So I've got my new brake line taped to the old original one, and I'm about to cut it off up here on top. I'm actually going to use just a file to cut it off. I'm just going to make a groove all the way around the outside edge and then bend the line back and forth to break it off. I could use a little pipe cutter, but this should make a little bit cleaner cut. We'll find out. It's kind of an experiment. So I got a nice little groove carved all the way around there. I think now if I just bend this back and forth a little bit, it should just break right off. Oh yeah, look at that. Nice and clean. Now the other benefit of doing it that way is that we don't have any burr on the inside, or very minimal amount of burr on the inside of that copper nickel pipe. But then it also helped us create our bevel on the outside. I'm going to widen that bevel out just a little bit, but that's pretty much what we want it to be. So you make sure you slide your flare nut on before you actually do your flare. So after you cut your pipe initially, there's going to be a little bit of a burr on the inside of it, and so you have to remove that burr somehow. And the way I did that actually is just using the end of this file and turning it as I pushed it in, and then that kind of brought the burr out. And then you take another file and flatten the outer surface until it's totally flush. Make sure you do this in a direction so that the little bits of metal fall out of the pipe and not into the brake line itself. And then you have to take and chamfer the outside edges of the pipe. So you can see I have a little bit of a bevel all the way around the outside, and so you just take a file and very carefully go around the outside and create that bevel. So now we're actually ready to do our double flare, and I'll show you how that goes. We're using the 3/16 inch size, so we'll get our pipe positioned. Now we take our flaring die and we use this as our depth gauge. So we slide this out until it meets that first collar. So we get that lined up with that die about an 1/8 inch out past the surface of the flaring tool, and then we'll clamp it in position. I'll take our flaring die, stick that on there. I'll make sure that everything looks nice and square, and then we're ready to tighten this, and this is going to create the bubble portion of our flare. So if we just tighten this down until the die hits the face of the flaring tool, like so. So we're half done with our flare here now. we're going to proceed with making this into a double flare by simply tightening our flaring tool down over the top of that bubble that we just made. Alright, I think that's good. Looks like a nice clean double flare. So we should be able to take that out, and this end of the brake line is complete. And there's what that looks like when it's all ready to go and ready to be tightened into wherever it needs to be. I have my first half of my union here attached and tightened, and then this is the remainder of the adapter that's going to that original fitting for the truck. I cleaned up these threads really well, and then I sprayed a little bit of black paint on here just to try to protect this little short piece of steel brake line that we're reusing. So we're now going to assemble this the rest of the way. The steel brake line needs to be tightened more than the copper nickel does. The copper nickel seals really well, this stuff that's on my left here, whereas this line on the right, like I said, is a steel line, so we do have to get that a little bit tighter. But we'll just get them pretty good and snug, and then we'll obviously check for leaks and make sure we don't have any before we finish up the project. The idea here is we're not going to use any sealants because brake line fittings are based on that flare connection, and we shouldn't have to use any sealant to make our fittings seal up properly. So I taped off both ends so that while I drag this line up and through the frame, hopefully I won't get too much debris in the line. So I'm going to do that now. It's pretty straightforward, not much to show you. Just put it back where the old one was. Okay, so I have the brake line all installed here now, and Simeon's been helping me bleed the brakes. Thank you, Simeon. So here's the setup. I have a little tube going over to this bucket. That's how much fluid we pumped through the system. But basically you just open the bleeder, have him step on the brakes, close the bleeder, and then have him release the brakes, and continue to do that until you get nice clean fluid coming back into your receptor like we've got here. So we did that on left rear, right rear. Up here is my line that we connected, and what I'm gonna have him do is just step on the brakes firmly, and we'll just make sure that all of our fittings are not leaking. Right there's our fitting. Yep, go ahead and press them pretty firmly. Nothing's gonna happen, I'm just checking them. You can pump them a little bit, so release it and pump it again. I don't see any accumulation there. That copper nickel fitting sealed up perfectly right there. Hi. Hi. Alright, here's our other fittings. So, okay, go ahead and step on the brakes again, Simeon. Does it feel mushy at all, or just pretty much hard?
Pretty much hard.
Yeah, I don't see any drips accumulating on our lines here. Yeah, it's very stiff. It's not going to the floor. So if there's a leak in your brake system, Simeon, when you press the brake, it'll just slowly go all the way down to the floor, and you'll have a puddle of brake fluid somewhere under the car. If the brakes go out in a vehicle, when you first step on the brakes, they'll still work a little bit, but the brake pedal will keep going down to the floor, and once it gets all the way to the bottom, then you'll lose all your brakes, totally, okay? So then you have to release and pump them again. And every time you pump them, it'll have still a little bit more brakes left. Make sense? Because it's leaking out somewhere, so it's going every time you press the brakes. And so if you need to get the vehicle stopped fast, you have to keep pumping them and pumping them. So it's basically draining this little brake reservoir, and once that totally runs out, then you for sure lose your brakes all the way. But as long as there's some fluid in there, every time you step on the brakes, you should have at least some braking. Make sense?
Yeah.
We should be good. We got clean fluid in there. Thanks for watching. Talk to you in the next one. This is your cat, Simeon?
Yep.
Can I have it?
No.
No? It would have a good life. It's such a friendly cat. I can't believe how friendly it is. All right.